Here we go. So to introduce myself, my name is Melanie Wacker. I'm head of Digital Resources Metadata at Columbia University Libraries. So over the years, I've trained a lot of new catalogers and metadata professionals. So when our colleagues from Metro reached out and asked, so can you talk about some experiences, some things that creep up over and over again when you're training new staff, new catalogers, could you give a presentation about that? I was very excited about that. For now, I get to talk for an hour about my personal pet peeves. So sorry about that. All right. So there are going to be a couple of questions from time to time where I asked you to maybe put an answer into the chat. And yeah, so let's get started. So number one, what I frequently notice, particularly in library school students and brand new catalogers, is the tendency to overanalyze. And I can completely sympathize with that, because after all, it's our job to make things findable, and we want to give good access and enough access to make sure our patrons find their way to the resources they need. But believe it or not, you can also hide resources by overanalyzing. So there is a vendor record that I ran across the other day, which is a case in point. So let's take a look at this description. So the title is 6 Excursions to Washington, D.C., 5 days at the national capital. It mentions Mount Vernon in passing there. But when you look at the country and state and the keyword and the theme, you have all kinds of things in there. Mexico, Arizona, you have Portugal, France, Italy, Austria, Hungary, you name it. So what happened here? I was surprised to find this, and so I noticed that there is this note, which is also in the description field, but that's besides the point. There's this note that there is an advertisement for a grand tour by special train to Europe. So I assume that's how all of these European countries got in there. But it's not that helpful, of course. So, if your patron looks for a resource about Denmark, they will probably not expect to find a pamphlet about excursions to Washington, D.C. They want a book about, or article at least, about Denmark. So here's another one that I ran across. It's an 11-page picture book, and it has 17 subject headings. Besides the point that, not all of these are actual subjects, it's written by a woman author, it's not about a woman author. There's still, I seriously doubt that it's substantially about dogs, toy horses, cats, rabbits, dogs, and so on. So a lot of subject headings that are probably not terribly helpful to somebody looking for actually resources about dogs. So luckily we have our subject heading manual. So the subject heading manual, which provides guidelines on how to use and apply the Library of Congress subject headings, is also a really good manual to get you started on to learn about subject analysis in general, regardless of what type of vocabulary you're applying. Particularly H180, assigning and constructing subject headings, is really helpful in giving guidance. So it really emphasizes that the subject headings are supposed to summarize the overall content of the work and provide access to the most important topic. And that also one should keep in mind, of course, what level you're cataloging about the collection, the subject would apply to the collection and not to every single letter that's in it. But if you're describing the item, of course, the access should be specific to the item. The number of headings may vary, but generally there shouldn't be more than 6. Of course, if you're using something that's fast, but it's not a string but broken up, it can be more than that. Generally more than 10, would be too much, I think. Another guideline, rule of thumb that's for LC staff in these guidelines, but that I find really useful to always keep in my own mind, is if the content on a specific topic covers more than 20% of the resource, it's worthwhile to assign a subject headings, but not if it's less than that, just as a rule of thumb. Going back to my slide here, I'm getting distracted, is once again, point 4 refers to the overall and most important topics. So if you have a textbook which has got geography, that's probably all you need. Which is exactly what point 5 is emphasizing again. The only reason to assign additional, more specific headings to a book about gymnastics, other than gymnastics, of course, would be if for some reason the book would cover more than 20% of on parallel bars for, And here's another example showing just that, a book about revolutions with emphasis on Cuba. So you have these two headings. And that is completely sufficient to give access. The rule of three, for subject analysis, we have other rules of three, but here it's, you have a book that covers two specific topics. In our example, it's peaches and apples, so you can be specific. It would be another fruit, oranges. You could add that too. But if it gets more than that, then it's really just about fruits. And we go to the next level up. So there are other guidelines in H180, but this is enough for now to help us reanalyze, going back to our example. So knowing what we know now, what kind of subject access would you assign? Maybe you could just throw some subjects into the chat. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to look up authorized terms, just keywords that come to mind that you would now assign that would be helpful. DC and Mount Vernon separately, that's a good one, yes. Washington DC travel, very good, yeah. Just remember, there's no hard and fast rule of right or wrong really, but train travel, yeah, exactly. So my possible solutions were Washington DC tours and Washington DC travel, as somebody suggested, or package tours. So if I would be working in a special library, as some of you are, and maybe we purchased this brochure because of that advertisement for the train trip, I might add one heading, Railroad Travel Europe, but that would be it. So then we have our example 2, our Christmas poem, it actually is, Hail of an Orphan Girl Who Receives Kindness from Strangers on Christmas Eve. Any thoughts on how you would provide access for this one now? Orphans in fiction, yeah. Yeah, orphans in fiction would probably be about a non-fiction book that's talking about works about orphans in fiction, but orphans in fiction and Christmas stories, yeah. So I did something very similar, Christmas, again, we all, nobody here is wrong. I did a genre Christmas story and juvenile poetry and then orphans and girls and charity. But yeah, the main component is the Christmas here, I would say too. So for subject access, we have the handy dandy subject heading manual to guide us, but we encounter the same question in assigning access points for creators and contributors. And some resources can have a lot of agents associated with the item. So how many and which ones do we list? How many are too many? How many are not enough? And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, in the case of the original RDA toolkit, it only tells us that the first one is required, and after then we can do whatever we want. So, of course, after that I go to the LCBCC policy guidelines, and but there it says it's up to catalogers' judgment, so it's still up to us. So what if I don't have any judgment in this case? So AACR2, some of you might remember, had the rule of 3 here. That was probably guided by the card catalog because there was only so much space on a card, and each additional access point would trigger yet another card. So that, of course, is not a consideration anymore. So we definitely don't want to agonize every time how much access we want to give. So guidance is out there. Some cataloging communities, local libraries, or library systems have their own documentation that you can find online. Here is one example where the guidance basically is after the first one should consider providing for each one that has a different role. So if you have authors and then you have an editor, you would add that editor. That's one way of doing it. Of course, there are a lot of guidelines from specialized cataloging community, such as, in this case, audiovisual resources. This is an example from Stanford's documentation, and that is based on the OLEC best practices for cataloging in DVDs and Blu-ray discs using RDA and Mark 21. I really like these examples that they have in there. So there's no need to create an access point for, for a movie, you see all these credits in the end, how many people are involved there. So there's no need to list every single one. There are also the options to use notes for production and for performers. the 511, 508, and then for anybody who's a creator, which means a creator according to RDA subfield I in terms of the role, plus the best known the stars of the movie, they would get actual access points in the 700. And there could still be quite a few, but it's a lot less, and it gives us something to go on. The music catalog community, of course, has its own guidelines that are really helpful. They go well beyond the RDA minimum, but most of performing music records tend to be very long and very detailed. So here they recommend an access point for all creators beyond the first for each work for which an access point is given. So I interpret that as, if you have a jazz CD and it has 3 pieces on it and each piece gets an entry, you give an access point to each of these creators. And then it goes even further. So if feasible, give access points for all arrangers and solo performers, conductors, and performing ensembles. Luckily, we don't have to give access points for the members of said ensembles. Those can be again listed in a note in the 511. In the end, it's up to us. But it's good to keep in mind that the community's best practices are out there for our guidance. I liked the consideration between creator and contributor. If somebody is a creator, he's probably closer related to the creation of the resource. But also just, we have to catalog more than one item a day. So keep in mind the number of potential access points that you're creating. And of course, your local context, what is important for your specific library. If I see somebody is working for Columbia, I might go the length and call it an extra access point. The effort involved has a lot to do with it. Which brings me to the next point. It's authority control, which is another one of my pet peeves, because I so often see that folks aren't checking or don't really know how to search the authority files correctly. So this is one of our examples. I'm airing some dirty laundry here too. So we have 4 access points for 2 different people here. To avoid this, we should make sure that the access points are matching the preferred form in the authority file, or if there is none, either create one or at least formulated according to current standards. If somebody would have searched the authority file, that person would have found the authority record, which is actually Abbott LF in the authorized access point in the 100 there. And the last person is really a different person, actually. So the patron searching for this person then would be able to retrieve all related resources in one search instead of having to click on every separate access point and figure out if it's the same person or not. So in the library environment, the Library of Congress and NACO libraries create or maintain the LCPCC authority files, and the records are stored and displayed in the MARC format, accessible via our utilities in OCLC or Sky River, whichever one you may be using, or via the web so LC's catalog and as linked open data at id.loc.gov. Searching the authority file, I think, is underrated. It's just so important. It's so easy to miss an authorized access point, particularly if an author uses different forms of the names or even different names. So we like to search under all variants and use both string and keyword searches. And once we find something that matches our string, it's really, really, really important to actually call up the authority and look at it. Here's one example from a couple of weeks ago. So this is a book published in German in Germany about an American actress and director. And one of the editors was Hannah Schoch. Now, in OCLC, when the access point is blue, it means it's linked to, it's controlled, it's linked to the authority. So let's take a look at our authority. And so if you look at the 10670, you probably notice the problem there. So this person is a Dutch architectural historian. So she probably doesn't write in German, and the topic is very different. Okay, sorry for this not very attractive slide, but I think it gets the point across. So in order to solve this, to sort this out, I upgraded the old authority to RDA so that I could add those 3 XX fields, Netherlands and architecture history, so that in the future somebody can tell at first glance what this person is writing and working about. And then I created an additional authority that I qualified as Americanist because I didn't have anything else to qualify her with, and documenting that she's actually in Zurich, writing in German, and her field is the United States, study and teaching. So hopefully in the future, these 2 authors will not get mixed, or editors in our case, will not get mixed up again. And but even if I know not everybody is an ACO member, doesn't have access to the authority file, may or may have a local authority file where you can do that. But even if I don't go to these lengths, I would always make sure I qualify the access point so that in the future this mix-up doesn't happen again. Of course, the opposite, many of you have probably seen that as well, publications by the same person under different names or different forms of the names, even on slightly different topics. And what I had in front of me just last week, and yes, we still catalog CD-ROMs from time to time. This was a CD documenting a 2008 conference, the Jewish Studies Forum in Auckland, New Zealand. And one of the editors there was Hannah Brodsky. Then I searched the authority OCLC BIP file and found Hannah Brodsky Defner also working in New Zealand, publishing about languages and literatures and translations and so on. So this name isn't that common, so I looked into it a little bit more. And thanks to Google, was able to verify that these 2 people were actually the same person. So the outcome was this authority record. Once I had verified that both are the same, I had to then figure out which form of the name do we use as a controlled access point. And in this case, following RDA, I checked which form was predominant, and it was really about the same. None was the latest form. She really uses them interchangeably all the time. So then it goes to the fuller form, which I then chose as the 1XX and cross-references from the others. So now we can find all our resources by this person under the same access point. Some of you may be part of the PCC, but I've been throwing this acronyms around, and some of you may not be familiar with it. So the PCC is a cataloging cooperative internationally, mostly North America, but they're partially outside America as well, consisting of these 4 programs: the NACO, the Name Authority Cooperative Program, SACO for the subject authorities, BIPCO for monographic BIP records, and CONSA for the serials. And luckily, my place of work is a member of all 4, but even if you're not, there is still a lot of it in it for you. Even you don't have to be a PCC member to obviously use your authority files, use the guidelines, best practices, and other documentation, use the training resources, and even participate in pilot projects or task forces. An example of some of the guidelines that are available, and it's really a small snippet on the bottom of the slide. You can see this go to the PCC reports and news archives, where you see a whole lot more. But there is a BIPCO standard record which documents what best practices to include, what fields to best include in a bibliographic record to produce a quality record. The same for the CONSA standard record for serials. If you want to know how to, if you wonder how to use the subfield E's, the relationship designators in the bibliographic records correctly, there are guidelines for that, really for all kinds of cases. And then there is a training available on the Catalogers Learning Workshop page, which includes BibFrame, FAST, LC subject headings, classification, IFLA LRM in preparation for the new official RDA, and you name it. So it's all free and openly available, and definitely worthwhile to go check back once in a while. Because as LC and Library of Congress and the PCC Standing Committee on Training puts out more resources, it gets posted there. One thing that's more an FYI, which is brand new, and you don't have to worry about it just yet, are the Library of Congress metadata guidance documentations. But if you run across those are designed to guide us to the new official RDA toolkit and provide some interpretations. But remember, the PCC date for implementation is no earlier than June 2023. And even then, the whole process is going to take a while. This is just an FYI, when the day comes, this is where you can find it. All right, our last topic, so some of you may be involved in digital collections cataloging. And we've just spent a lot of time talking about, following standards in our MAR catalog. That's generally not that controversial. However, folks often make up their own rules when it comes to the non-MARC environment. And partially that might be due to other stakeholders who do accept that the MARC database is more or less a domain of the cataloger or the metadata specialist, but may have very strong feelings when it comes to their digital projects as to how access should be provided or not. So there's a tendency to include a lot of localized decisions, and sometimes there are good reasons for that. From time to time, it's just not to be avoided. But for the institutional repository, digital project, or even digital humanities project, there is a huge drawback by going local too much. It's much more advisable, and I'm speaking from painful experience, to really integrate it into your environment wherever you're working. And those are the reasons. You may be designing as a standalone project, but if it's all local decisions and maybe a local taxonomy, local schema, then you might paint yourself into a corner if later on you do want to share your data. Or if, for example, the items that get digitized are from your collection, you have perfectly good MARC records. You don't want to start rekeying. You want to be able to export from one system and import into the other if possible. Your data will be reused eventually, just a rule of thumb. You may migrate systems at some point, or better, you will migrate systems at some point. We all do. Teams change, and if you have too many local practices, it's really hard to keep things consistent across different projects and over time. I've maintained some local taxonomies and vocabularies, and I can tell you it's a lot of work, and generally those get abandoned if the person who's maintaining the, say, taxonomy is leaving for another job or retiring. And just consistency will be difficult to enforce with local. And I mentioned the on-the-horse problem. Some people may already heard about that, but I'll get into that later. So here's an example. This is an old project that we did maybe 10 years ago, and this was a standalone site, but we followed regular cataloging standards. It's MODS, metadata object description schema, but we're using name authority, access points, and LCSH, and so on. Because it's a site that focuses on one single collection, it's the same repository, it's a photograph collection, so it's all photographs. It's all part of the same archival collection. So what was important here for this site was places, topics, subject names, and creators. So these are what's being brought out in the interface. But we start with essentially BibGo style, what is important cataloging, even though it's in MODS. And it did pay off because years later it got migrated to our digital collections site where we cross-search all of our digital collections. So now suddenly we need the format because it's not all photographs anymore. We need the library collection, the archival collection, because we have many archival collections and we have many repositories and we have a much wider range. So, but the point here is that it's all the same data. So we didn't have to redo anything to migrate from one to the other interface because it's all consistent throughout all our projects. I'm not saying that we don't make mistakes and sometimes have our localization also, but we're trying in general to keep it consistent. And this is probably a better, more recent example. One of my colleagues discovered an old stack of technical reports from the Earth Observatory at Columbia, and suggested that it might be a nice project to get those digitized and made available online through our institutional repository. But when we looked into it, we discovered that a lot of these reports already had perfectly good MARC records in OCLC and WorldCat. And so we decided to bring those in and start off with that metadata. In the end, we were able to provide access through WorldCat, HathiTrust, our local catalog, Internet Archive, and Academic Commons institutional repository. So we started out bringing in, we had to create a few new ones, but most of them already had records for the print version, for the original records. This is our local catalog. And then from there, we simply derived descriptions for the digital versions and then contributed those back to OCLC, to WorldCat. So now all is available there. And then we contributed the data to this is Internet Archive, and this is institutional repository. And it's all the same data, which is a nice thing. One thing that's different about Academic Commons compared to the previous ones is that Academic Commons runs on mods. So in order to reuse the data we have, because we reuse data between systems a lot, so we have a standard mapping table and script set up to do the transformation. But for every project, we have to still go through it and make sure that there are, somebody mentioned the series field for local data. Series was one issue because in the institutional repository, people expected to find all of these technical reports under one series entry because that interface doesn't take advantage of the earlier later as a catalog does. So that was one difference, but generally, luckily, it was all default data. On the very right side, we can see default, and that's what we like to see because every time we have local data, our developer has to get involved and write something different. So some additional best practices to consider: to always use the metadata elements is intended to, regardless of schema. I know when one is stuck with some systems come with simple Dublin core, and there's a tendency to redefine elements because there's no place to put the information that you need, but it always causes problems later on. Regardless in which environment you're cataloging, even for the digital humanities project, to stick with standards and controlled vocabularies, and to keep minimal descriptions in mind. So back to my on the horse problem. Some of you may have already heard that story, but I forgot who originally told it, but it was metadata that was reused, which is good from a finding aid, which of course is hierarchical. So a hierarchy said it was a collection about George Washington, I think it was. And then these images were about George Washington on the horse, but because the information wasn't translated down, all that was left on the item level, then in the project was on the horse. So we want to avoid that. So important to always document your decisions. 5 years from now, you will have no idea what decisions you made or why, and neither will anybody else. I'm going back a lot to our old documentation because there's always somebody who asks, why did we do that? And we can pull this out and say, because we decided this for this reason. So working in the library, of course, I tend to default to the Library of Congress and to PCC vocabulary and standards. But given the growing awareness of the diversity of our community or communities, rather, plus the ongoing move to link open data and the need for readily available identifiers, there's also the need to broaden our view a bit. So if a name is not available in the name authority file, or if the name authority file simply doesn't fit the institution that you're working in, there are other options out there. So including ULAN's Union List of Artist Names, if you're cataloging art, or ISNI or ORCID for researcher identifiers, or via this international scope of Wikidata. Actually, there were PCC pilots project on using ISNI and Wikidata in our cataloging, which were considered very successful and were very popular. Guidelines on how to use them, how to integrate them in our day-to-day work are still being worked out and are forthcoming. But just pointing out that there are other options out there. And sometimes in our digital collection, we are actually also using ISNI and via interchangeable with the name authority. This may be even more important for subject access. LCSH, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, has shortcomings of outdated and at times plain offensive terminology. And there may be areas where you want to choose additional or alternate subject terms. But again, it's better if there's something already available on the network level where the group is already working on it and is, more importantly, maintaining it. So here are some that I have pulled out of other resources. The cataloging lab has a great list of alternate vocabularies. The homosaurus is probably well known to many of you, and there is no prohibition even in the MARC environment to use alternate vocabulary if that is needed right now. So wrapping up, striking the right balance can be tough, but just remember that we are cataloging and not indexing. And that there is a lot of guidance out there that we can take advantage of, and it's not behind a paywall. And authority work, of course, we take advantage of authorities and identity management sources as much as possible in whatever setting we're working in. And I know that sometimes might take some convincing on the administrative level because it is initially more effort. It can be a lot more effort, I'm not lying. But in the long run, it makes the work easier and produces a better outcome. So, okay, I'm not repeating all of this. My core message. And here are some of the links to the resources that I mentioned if you want to go back and revisit them later. All right, thank you all.